The November rain hammered against the windows of the Massachusetts Historical Society building on Boylston Street. Inside the climate-controlled archive room, Dr. Sarah Chen carefully placed the daguerreotype onto the examination table, her latex-gloved hands trembling with excitement. The photograph had arrived that morning from the estate of Margaret Whitmore, a 94-year-old woman who had passed away 3 weeks earlier. Sarah adjusted the magnifying lamp, its LED light casting a cold glow over the copper plate. The image showed 6 young men, brothers according to the handwritten note, standing before a textile mill. The photograph bore the stamp of J.H. Bufford's lithography studio, dated March 1860. The brothers wore dark suits, their faces carrying the characteristic stillness required by long exposure times. Another Civil War-era portrait, her colleague Marcus Rodriguez said, leaning over her shoulder. "What makes this one special?" Sarah pointed to the architectural details. "Look at that building, the tower, the arched windows. I think this might be the Ashford Mill, the one that burned in 1862. Marcus pulled up a chair. The Ashford Mill fire was one of Boston's forgotten tragedies, a blaze that killed 37 workers, mostly Irish immigrants and freed black men. The fire had been ruled accidental, but rumors of locked doors and ignored safety violations persisted. The Whitmore estate donation, Sarah continued, consulting her notes. It came with a letter from Margaret herself, written just days before she died. She said her great-great-grandfather worked at that mill. She wanted us to have this photograph because the truth should be known before I go. The words sent a chill through the room. Sarah picked up the high-resolution scanner, positioning it over the daguerreotype. The machine hummed softly as it captured every detail of the 165-year-old image. As the scan appeared on her monitor, Sarah began the process she had performed thousands of times. She zoomed in on different sections, examining clothing, background, searching for clues. The brothers' faces appeared first, each bearing resemblance to the others. High cheekbones and deep-set eyes. She moved to the background, studying the mill's facade. The brickwork was detailed enough to count stones. Windows reflected March sunlight. And then she saw it. In one window, barely visible in the original but clear in the magnified digital image, were faces. Multiple faces, pressed against glass from inside. Sarah's breath caught. She increased magnification, pulse quickening. "Marcus," she whispered, "look at this." He moved closer to the screen. The faces in the window were distinct. Men, women, even children, their expressions captured in that fraction of a second. But it was their eyes that made both historians pull back from the monitor. Wide, desperate, filled with terror that transcended the limitations of 19th century photography. "That's impossible," Marcus said. Exposure time for daguerreotypes was at least 15 seconds. These people would have had to hold still, and you can see they're moving. Sarah's hand shook as she zoomed further. Behind the faces, the interior was visible, shadows suggesting machinery and hanging fabric. But there was something else. The people weren't workers casually glancing out. They were trapped. Hands pressed flat against glass, mouths open in what could only be screams. "We need to call Dr. Patterson," Sarah said, referring to their department head, "and maybe the police." "The police? Sarah, this is a photograph from 1860. I know what year it is, Marcus, but look at the floor beneath where they're standing. Zoom in on that corner." Marcus took control of the mouse, navigating to the section Sarah indicated. The mill floor, visible through a gap in machinery, was covered with something dark. At first glance, it could have been oil or coal dust, common in industrial settings. But the pattern, the way it pooled in certain areas, suggested something else. Sarah opened her laptop and began searching the Society's digital archives. She found a document and scrolled rapidly. "Here," she said, turning the laptop so Marcus could see. In 1861, a mill worker named Patrick Donnelly gave testimony before a Labour committee. He claimed that the Ashford Mill sometimes locked workers inside during shifts to prevent theft and unauthorised breaks. He said he quit after seeing ungodly things in the basement levels, but he refused to elaborate, saying his family had been threatened. Threatened by whom? He didn't say. The testimony was dismissed as the ravings of a disgruntled employee. 3 months later, Donnelly disappeared. His body was found in the Charles River, officially ruled a suicide, though his widow insisted he couldn't swim and would never have gone near the water. Marcus stood and walked to the window, looking out at the rain-soaked city. You're suggesting this photograph captured evidence of something criminal at the Ashford Mill in 1860. But why would anyone take a photograph with that visible? And who are these 6 brothers? Sarah was already typing, accessing census records. The note said they were the Ashford brothers. Let me check for any connection to the mill's name. The search results appeared within seconds. The Ashford Mill had been owned and operated by the Ashford family, specifically 6 brothers who inherited the business from their father in 1857. Their names were listed: Cornelius, Nathaniel, Edmund, Thomas, William, and George Ashford. Sarah compared the list to the faces in the photograph. It's them, the mill owners. They posed for this photograph in front of their own factory. She paused, staring at the screen. Marcus, all 6 died within 2 years. Cornelius and Nathaniel in the 1862 fire, Edmund in a carriage accident, Thomas from illness, William from a fall, and George. George disappeared in 1863. That's a hell of a coincidence, Marcus said quietly. Or a pattern. Sarah pulled up more documents. Look at this newspaper article from April 1862, after the fire. The Boston Herald interviewed survivors. One woman, Grace Murphy, said the fire started in the basement, not the spinning room, like the official report claimed. She said they saw smoke through the floorboards, and when they tried to leave, the doors were locked from outside. Jesus Christ! It gets worse. The article mentions that 37 people died in the fire, but there's a footnote here. 23 additional workers were listed as missing in the weeks following the fire, presumed to have left the city. But Marcus, look at the names. Half of them were immigrants with no family in Boston, people who wouldn't be reported missing, people who could disappear without anyone making a fuss. The room felt colder now, the rain outside seeming to press against the windows with greater urgency. Sarah returned to the magnified photograph, studying the faces trapped behind the glass. She began counting them, marking each face with a digital marker on the screen. When she finished, her hand was shaking so badly she had to put down the stylus. 23 faces in that window, the exact number of missing workers listed after the fire. Marcus sat down heavily in his chair. This photograph was taken 2 years before the fire. Are you saying these people were already trapped in there? That the Ashford brothers posed for a portrait in front of their mill while workers were imprisoned inside? Sarah didn't answer immediately. She was thinking about Margaret Whitmore's final letter, her insistence that the truth should be known. She pulled up the genealogy records, tracing the Whitmore family tree. Margaret's great-great-grandfather, John Whitmore, had indeed worked at the Ashford Mill. He had testified at the inquest following the fire, but his testimony had been brief and unremarkable. He said he wasn't working the day of the fire, having been dismissed the previous week for insubordination. But there was another notation in the records. John Whitmore had been one of the workers who helped clean up after the fire, removing debris and recovering bodies. In his personal diary, now part of the Society's collection, he had written a single entry about that experience. Sarah found it in the digital archive, dated May 15, 1862. The things we found in the basement. God forgive me for my silence, but they said they would kill my wife and daughter if I spoke. The bones were not from the fire. They had been there for years, some of them. The chains were still attached to the walls. I helped them cover it up, brick over the worst of it, cart away what we could before the proper authorities arrived. Mr. Cornelius Ashford burned with his own sins, but his brothers lived, and they remember who helped them. I am cursed with this knowledge. I will never sleep soundly again. The archive room was silent except for the rain and the soft hum of electronic equipment. Sarah and Marcus stared at the screen, the implications of what they were reading settling over them like a physical weight. "We need to contact the police," Marcus said finally. "Historic Crimes Division, maybe the FBI. This is evidence of murder, multiple murders, possibly human trafficking or forced labor." Sarah nodded, but her mind was already racing ahead. The basement of the Ashford Mill. The building burned, but the foundation might still be intact. The area where the mill stood is now part of the Seaport District. High-rise condominiums and office buildings. "You think someone should excavate?" "I think we have an obligation to pursue this. These people deserve to be acknowledged, identified if possible. And Margaret Whitmore didn't send us this photograph just to have it sit in an archive. She wanted the truth exposed." Marcus pulled out his phone. "I'm calling Dr. Patterson. Then we need to document everything we've found tonight. Chain of custody, our observations, the archival research. This is going to be huge, Sarah. This could rewrite part of Boston's industrial history." As he walked toward the hallway to make the call, Sarah remained at her desk, staring at the photograph. She zoomed in once more on the faces in the window, seeing now what she hadn't noticed before. One of the faces, a young woman near the center of the group, was looking directly at the camera. Not at the six brothers posing in the foreground, but at the lens itself. Her mouth was open, and through the miracle or curse of photographic technology, her expression had been frozen for 165 years. It was not just terror in her eyes, but pleading. A final desperate attempt to be seen, to be remembered, to have her existence acknowledged. Sarah saved the enhanced image and began preparing her report. Outside, the November rain continued to fall on Boston, washing the streets the same way it had in 1860, when six brothers posed for a photograph that would carry their secrets into the future. Dr. Elizabeth Patterson arrived at the archive room within the hour, her silver hair still damp from the rain despite her umbrella. She was 62 years old, a historian who had dedicated 40 years to documenting New England's industrial past. And Sarah had never seen her look shaken until she stood before the magnified image on the monitor. "Dear God," she whispered, adjusting her glasses, as if clearer vision might somehow change what she was seeing. "How did we not know about this?" "The photograph only arrived this morning," Sarah explained. "Without digital magnification, these details are nearly invisible to the naked eye." Dr. Patterson pulled up a chair and spent the next 20 minutes examining every section of the image, while Sarah and Marcus briefed her on their findings. When they mentioned John Whitmore's diary entry, she went pale. "I read that diary 10 years ago when we first acquired it. I remember that entry, but without context I assumed he was traumatized by the fire itself, by the bodies he helped recover. I never imagined." She trailed off, her fingers pressed against her temples. "What do we do now?" Marcus asked. "This is evidence of crimes that occurred over 160 years ago. Is there even a protocol for this?" Dr. Patterson stood and walked to the window, looking out at the glittering lights of modern Boston. "There's precedent. In 2018, researchers in New York discovered evidence of mass burials beneath Washington Square Park, African Americans buried in unmarked graves in the 1800s. The city conducted archaeological surveys, identified remains where possible, created memorials. But those were known burial sites that had been forgotten. This," she turned back to face them, "this suggests active concealment of murder." "We need to contact the authorities," Sarah said. but also historians who specialize in this period, forensic archaeologists, maybe even genealogists who can help identify potential descendants of the victims. First, we need to verify everything we can about the photograph itself, Dr. Patterson said, her professional training reasserting itself over her emotional response. We need to confirm it's authentic, that it hasn't been altered or manipulated in any way. We need to document the provenance, examine the materials, date the daguerreotype scientifically. I can have it authenticated by tomorrow afternoon, Marcus offered. I know a specialist at Harvard who does chemical analysis of photographic materials. Good. Sarah, I want you to compile everything we have in our archives about the Ashford Mill, the Ashford family, and the 1862 fire. Every document, every newspaper clipping, every piece of correspondence. We need to build a complete picture. Dr. Patterson paused, her expression grave. And we need to find out what's beneath that location now. Sarah pulled up a map of Boston on her laptop. The Ashford Mill was located on what's now Harbor Street, in the Seaport District. According to city planning records, the site was redeveloped in 1998. There's currently a luxury residential building there, 32 stories, called the Maritime Residences. Jesus, Marcus muttered. People are living on top of what might be a mass grave. We don't know that for certain, Dr. Patterson cautioned, though her tone suggested she believed it was a strong possibility. But we need to find out. I'm going to call a friend at the city planning department. If we can get access to the original foundation surveys done before construction in 1998, we might be able to determine if anything unusual was discovered during excavation. Over the next 3 hours, the archive room became a command center. Dr. Patterson made calls to city officials, forensic anthropologists, and legal experts who specialized in historic cases. Marcus arranged for the photograph to be transported to Harvard under armed security, treating it with the reverence usually reserved for priceless artifacts. Sarah dove into the archives, pulling up documents that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of the Ashford family and their business practices. The Ashford brothers had inherited the mill from their father, Silas Ashford, in 1857. Silas had been a prominent figure in Boston's industrial community, known for his ruthless business tactics and his vocal opposition to labor reform. When he died, control of the mill passed equally to his 6 sons, who continued his practices and, according to the evidence Sarah was uncovering, expanded them into darker territory. She found employment records showing an unusually high turnover rate at the Ashford Mill compared to other textile factories in Boston. Workers would be hired and then simply disappear from the records after a few weeks or months, with no indication of where they went. The pattern was especially pronounced among immigrant workers and free black laborers, people on society's margins who could vanish without raising alarms. There were also curious financial records. The mill's expenses included regular payments to a security service that employed unusually large numbers of men for a facility of its size. Sarah cross-referenced the names of these security workers with city records and found that several had criminal backgrounds, including arrests for assault and intimidation. As dawn broke over Boston, casting weak November light through the windows, Sarah discovered something that made her call Dr. Patterson over immediately. It was a letter, tucked into a collection of business correspondence from 1861, written by Edmund Ashford to his brother Nathaniel. The basement arrangement continues to prove profitable. Edmund had written, "We have secured 15 new contracts with the southern interests you mentioned, and the discreet transportation logistics you arranged ensure minimal exposure. Father would be proud of how we've expanded his vision. The workers upstairs remain ignorant, and our security team has proven effective at discouraging questions. I recommend we continue this venture until the current political situation makes it untenable." Dr. Patterson read the letter 3 times, her face growing more severe with each reading. Southern interests, discreet transportation. This was written in 1861. Sarah. The country was on the brink of civil war. The South was desperate to maintain its economic power, and Boston had significant financial ties to Southern cotton. "You think they were involved in human trafficking?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. "I think they were involved in slavery, operating in a state where it was illegal, using the mill as a cover for holding and transporting enslaved people, possibly also free black workers they kidnapped." Dr. Patterson's hands were shaking as she held the letter. The faces in that window, the basement John Whitmore described, the chains on the walls. This wasn't just labor exploitation. This was a slave operation hidden in plain sight in Boston. The revelation hung in the air between them. Sarah thought about the faces in the photograph, the terror in their eyes. The 23 people who had been missing after the fire. She thought about the Ashford brothers, posing proudly in front of their mill, while human beings suffered in the basement beneath their feet, so confident in their power and impunity that they saw no danger in capturing that moment for posterity. "The photograph," Sarah said slowly. "They didn't know what it would show. Daguerreotypes were still relatively new technology. They couldn't review the image before it was developed. They posed for what they thought was a portrait of successful businessmen, and instead they accidentally documented their own crimes." Dr. Patterson nodded. "And then, 2 years later, the mill burns. Cornelius and Nathaniel die in the fire, presumably trapped in the basement trying to destroy evidence or rescue whatever made them wealthy enough to risk their lives. The other brothers die in mysterious circumstances within the next year. It's almost like retribution," Marcus finished, returning from the hallway where he had been coordinating the photograph's transport. "Except there's nothing supernatural about it. Someone killed them. Maybe other mill workers who found out the truth. Maybe the families of victims. Maybe even business partners who wanted to eliminate loose ends. George Ashford disappeared in 1863 and was never found," Sarah added. "That's the same year Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Whatever operation they were running would have become infinitely more dangerous. Maybe George tried to run." Dr. Patterson pulled out her phone. "I'm calling Detective Frank Morrison. He works in the BPD's Historical Crimes Unit. If anyone can navigate the legal and jurisdictional nightmare this is going to become, it's him." While she made the call, Sarah returned to the photograph, studying the faces once more. She began trying to identify them, cross-referencing with missing persons reports from the era, slave narratives, and immigration records. It was painstaking work, made more difficult by the incompleteness of historical records, especially for marginalized communities. But she was determined to give these people their names back if possible. By mid-morning, Detective Morrison arrived with a team that included a forensic archaeologist, a legal expert from the district attorney's office, and a representative from the mayor's office. The archive room, usually a quiet sanctuary of scholarship, became a crime scene investigation spanning 3 centuries. Dr. Catherine Wells, the forensic archaeologist, studied the photograph with the practiced eye of someone who had excavated mass graves in Bosnia and Rwanda. If there are remains at that location, and if they've been undisturbed despite the 1998 construction, we could potentially recover them. But we'll need ground-penetrating radar surveys, core samples, and permission from the property owners and the city to conduct an archaeological investigation. "The property is privately owned," the mayor's representative, a sharp-eyed woman named Jennifer Kim, pointed out. "The maritime residences. We can't just order an excavation without cause, and a 165-year-old photograph, however compelling, might not constitute sufficient legal grounds." "What about John Whitmore's diary?" Sarah protested. That's a first-hand account of finding human remains and evidence of imprisonment. It's also vague and could be interpreted multiple ways, Jennifer replied, though not unkindly. I want to help, but I need to be realistic about what's legally possible. We need more evidence, contemporary accounts, something that creates a legal pathway to investigation. Sarah felt frustration building in her chest, but Dr. Patterson placed a calming hand on her shoulder. Then we find more evidence. Sarah, Marcus, we go through every document in this building if we have to. Detective Morrison, can your people access police records from the 1860s? There must have been investigations, complaints, something on file. Over the next week, the investigation expanded. Harvard confirmed the photograph's authenticity, the chemical analysis of the daguerreotype consistent with materials and techniques used in 1860. Marcus discovered additional letters in the Ashford family papers, including one from William Ashford to a contact in Charleston, South Carolina, discussing merchandise and shipping schedules in language that barely disguised human trafficking. Sarah found newspaper articles that had been overlooked in previous research, small notices about workers who vanished, families seeking information about missing relatives who had last been employed at the Ashford mill. There was a pattern of disappearances clustering around the mill, occurring regularly between 1857 and early 1862. The most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. A researcher at the New England Historic Genealogical Society contacted Dr. Patterson about a diary that had recently been donated. It belonged to a woman named Rebecca Thompson, a free black woman who had worked as a domestic servant in Boston in the 1850s and 60s. In her diary, dated September 1861, Rebecca wrote about her sister, Grace, who had gone to work at the Ashford mill and had not been seen since. Rebecca had gone to the mill to ask about Grace and had been turned away by guards who claimed no one by that name had ever been employed there. But Rebecca knew her sister had been hired because she had walked her to the mill on her first day. I saw fear in the guard's eyes when I pressed him, Rebecca wrote. He looked over his shoulder, back toward the mill building, as if afraid of being overheard. Then he leaned close and whispered, "Stop asking questions if you value your life. Your sister is gone. Pray that God has mercy on her soul, because mortal men did not." I ran from that place, terrified, and I have not returned. But I think of Grace every day, trapped in some hell I cannot reach. The diary entry was accompanied by a sketch Rebecca had made of her sister, a beautiful young woman with kind eyes and a hopeful expression. Sarah pinned the sketch next to the magnified photograph and began comparing it to the faces in the window. It took hours, but she finally found her. Grace Thompson was there, third from the left in the second row, her face pressed against the glass, her silent scream frozen for eternity. "We have her name," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Grace Thompson. We know who she was." The discovery energized the investigation. With a named victim and contemporary accounts documenting her disappearance, the legal pathway Jennifer Kim needed began to materialize. The district attorney's office opened an official investigation into the Ashford mill, treating it as a cold case despite its age. Permission was granted for a limited archaeological survey of the site beneath the maritime residences. The building's residents were informed through careful diplomatic channels. Most were cooperative, though some worried about the impact on their property values. The survey began on a cold December morning, exactly 1 month after Sarah had first examined the photograph. Dr. Catherine Wells and her team used ground-penetrating radar to scan the foundation areas that corresponded to the original mill basement. The building's modern foundation had been built around and on top of the older structure, incorporating some of the original stonework. What they found made the news that evening. Beneath the northwestern corner of the building, in an area that had been sealed off and filled in during the 1998 construction, the radar detected anomalies consistent with a concealed chamber. More disturbing were the returns suggesting multiple objects of density consistent with bone. A court order was obtained. Careful excavation began. What they found in that sealed chamber would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. The excavation took 3 weeks, working in careful shifts around the building's structural requirements and the lives of the residents above. Dr. Wells insisted on painstaking archaeological method, documenting every layer of soil, every artifact, every bone. The media had gotten wind of the story, and news vans lined the street outside the maritime residences, cameras ready to capture any development in what was being called Boston's hidden horror. Sarah was there every day, observing from behind the barriers, taking notes, occasionally being consulted when historical context was needed. On the 16th day of excavation, Dr. Wells emerged from the site, her face ashen, and requested a private meeting with Dr. Patterson, Detective Morrison, and Sarah. They convened in a trailer that had been set up as a temporary command center. Dr. Wells pulled off her work gloves and sat down heavily before speaking. "We've found 28 individuals so far," she said, her voice flat with the professional detachment that people in her field cultivated to cope with horror. Men, women, and children. Based on preliminary analysis, they died between 1858 and 1862. Many show signs of trauma, both healed and perimortem, malnutrition, disease, evidence of shackling. She paused, swallowing hard. There are also artifacts, chains, manacles, pieces of cloth, personal items, and documents. Documents? Dr. Patterson leaned forward. A ledger, mostly damaged by water and time, but our conservators think they can recover some of it. It appears to be a record of some kind, names and numbers. Also letters, some of them hidden inside the walls, as if someone hoped they would be found someday. Sarah felt her heart pounding. Can we see them? They're being conserved now. It'll be weeks before we can fully examine them without causing more damage. But I've seen enough to tell you that this was systematic, organized. The chamber was purpose-built for confinement. There are rings bolted into the walls, ventilation shafts that were deliberately small to prevent escape, a single entrance that could be secured from the outside. Detective Morrison stood and walked to the window, looking out at the modern city. So the Ashford brothers built a prison in their mill basement and used it to hold enslaved people, free black workers they kidnapped, immigrants who they could exploit and murder without consequence. That's what the evidence suggests, Doctor. Wells confirmed. We're coordinating with forensic anthropologists, historians, and genealogists to try to identify as many of the victims as possible. DNA analysis, comparison with historical records, anything that might give us names. Over the following weeks, the story that emerged was worse than anyone had imagined. The ledger, once conserved and analyzed, revealed a meticulously kept record of human trafficking. The Ashford brothers had been running a multi-state operation, working with associates in the South to traffic enslaved people northward, using them for labor in the mill under threat of death, and then disposing of them when they became too sick or too knowledgeable of the operation to be useful. Free black workers and poor immigrants were also targeted, lured with promises of good wages, and then imprisoned, forced to work in the most dangerous areas of the mill, and eventually killed to prevent them from exposing the operation. The ledger listed them by number rather than name, a dehumanizing practice that made Sarah feel physically ill every time she read it. The letters hidden in the walls were heartbreaking. One, written by a man named Samuel, who identified himself as a free black carpenter from New York, described how he had been attacked while walking near the docks, drugged, and woken up chained in the mill basement. He wrote that he had tried to escape twice and had been beaten both times. The letter ended mid-sentence, as if he had been interrupted while writing it. Another letter, in careful handwriting, was from a woman named Catherine. She wrote to her mother, knowing the letter would never be sent, telling her about the other prisoners, about a child who had died of fever, about the guards who brought minimal food and water. "I try to remember sunlight," she wrote. "I try to remember your face. I fear I am forgetting what the world outside these walls looks like. If you ever learn what became of me, know that I thought of you at the end." Sarah read these letters in the archive room late at night, when the building was quiet and she could cry without anyone seeing. She thought about the faces in the photograph, about Grace Thompson and the 27 other people found in that chamber, about all the others who might have been killed and disposed of elsewhere, bodies that might never be found. The investigation expanded beyond Boston. Historians and law enforcement in other states began examining their own records, looking for similar patterns around textile mills and industrial facilities in the pre-Civil War era. What they found suggested that the Ashford operation, while particularly brutal and well documented due to the photograph, was not unique. Human trafficking disguised as industrial labor had been more widespread than historical records had previously indicated. Meanwhile, the work of identifying the victims continued. DNA was extracted from bones and compared against databases of descendants who had submitted samples hoping to trace their ancestry. Forensic reconstructions were created. Historical records were scoured for missing persons reports, family letters, any clue that might connect a name to remains. 3 months after the excavation began, they had identified 7 of the 28 victims, including Grace Thompson. Her DNA matched a descendant living in Atlanta, a woman named Patricia Chambers, who broke down crying when she received the news that her ancestor had finally been found. "My grandmother told me stories about Grace," Patricia said during a video call with Sarah and Dr. Patterson. "How she disappeared and the family never knew what happened. There were theories, whispers, but no proof. It's terrible, but it's also a relief. We can finally lay her to rest properly." The city of Boston, under intense public pressure and moral obligation, committed to a full memorial and proper burial for all the victims. The site where the Ashford Mill had stood would be commemorated with a monument listing all known victims and acknowledging the unknown ones. Legislation was proposed to mandate archaeological surveys before any construction on sites with industrial history from that era. But for Sarah, the work wasn't finished. She had become obsessed with understanding the full scope of what had happened, with finding justice even across the barrier of centuries. She spent her days researching the Ashford brothers, tracing their associates, mapping out the network that had enabled their crimes. It was during this research that she made a discovery that connected the past to the present in an unexpected way. She found a land deed from 1863 showing that George Ashford, the brother who had disappeared, had sold his share of the mill property to a man named Josiah Crane just weeks before vanishing. Curious, Sarah traced what had happened to that property. The chain of ownership was complex, passing through several hands over the decades, but in 1998, when the Maritime Residences was built, the land was owned by a development company called Crane Enterprises. Sarah cross-referenced the name and found that Crane Enterprises was still operating, now run by a man named Harrison Crane, who sat on multiple boards and was a prominent figure in Boston real estate. On a hunch, she began researching the Crane family history. What she discovered made her blood run cold. Josiah Crane had been the chief of security for the Ashford Mill, the man who had hired the guards, the man who would have been directly involved in imprisoning and controlling the victims. He had bought George Ashford's share of the property for a fraction of its value, suggesting either blackmail or a payoff. The Crane family had built their wealth on that initial purchase. They had developed the property after the mill burned, always staying one step ahead of any investigation, always controlling what was built on that cursed ground. And in 1998, they had built a luxury residential building directly on top of the mass grave, sealing it beneath concrete and steel. Sarah brought her findings to Detective Morrison. "They knew," she said, spreading documents across his desk. "The Crane family knew what was buried there. They've known for 165 years, and they've been profiting from that land while keeping the secret." Morrison studied the documents, his expression growing darker. "This is going to be hard to prove. We can show that Josiah Crane worked at the mill and bought the property, but proving that his descendants knew about the bodies is another matter entirely." "What about the 1998 construction?" Sarah pressed. "Someone doing a foundation survey would have found evidence of the old basement chamber. There would have been reports, assessments, something that would have flagged an unusual structure." Morrison made a phone call. 2 hours later, he called Sarah back. "We subpoenaed the construction records from 1998. There's a gap in the documentation. A structural engineer's report that should exist doesn't. The foreman from the construction company agreed to talk to us. He retired years ago, has no loyalty to Crane Enterprises anymore." The foreman, a man named Eddie Walsh, met them at a coffee shop in South Boston. He was in his 70s, weathered by decades of construction work, and he looked relieved to finally tell his story. "We found it during excavation," he said, stirring his coffee with hands that shook slightly. "The old chamber, the bones, everything. I reported it to the project manager, who reported it to Harrison Crane. Crane came to the site personally, and I'll never forget what he said. He told us that if we wanted to keep our jobs and our families safe, we would seal that chamber, destroy any evidence of what we found, and never speak of it again." "He threatened you?" Morrison asked. "Not directly, but the message was clear. And we were working-class guys. We had families to feed, mortgages to pay. Crane had the power to ruin us. So we did what he said. We sealed the chamber, poured concrete over it, destroyed our reports, and kept our mouths shut for 27 years. Sarah felt rage building in her chest. 27 years. All those people could have been identified, given proper burials. Their families could have had closure, but instead they were entombed again so a rich man could protect his family's reputation and his property values. "I've lived with the guilt every day since," Eddie said quietly. "When I heard about the excavation, I knew it was time to come forward. I don't care what Crane does to me now. I'm old, and I want to die with a clear conscience." Armed with Eddie Walsh's testimony and the documentary evidence Sarah had compiled, the investigation expanded to include Harrison Crane. He was arrested on charges of concealing evidence of a crime, obstruction of justice, and abuse of a corpse. The arrest of a prominent businessman for crimes connected to a 165-year-old case made national headlines. Crane's lawyers argued that he couldn't be held responsible for crimes committed by the Ashford brothers in the 1860s, but prosecutors pointed out that his crime was the recent concealment, not the original murders. The legal battle became a test case about historical crimes, responsibility, and the limits of covering up the past. During the trial, which began in the fall, a year after Sarah had first examined the photograph, the full horror of the Ashford Mill operation was laid out for the public. Historians testified about the industrial conditions of the era. Forensic anthropologists described the evidence of abuse and murder, and descendants of victims shared their families' stories of loss and uncertainty. The trial also became a broader conversation about America's hidden history, about the crimes committed in pursuit of profit, about the systems of oppression that had allowed people to be treated as commodities. The faces in the photograph, once invisible, now looked out from news broadcasts and newspaper front pages, demanding acknowledgement and justice. Harrison Crane was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison. His company was forced to pay millions in restitution. funds that were used to create a scholarship program for descendants of the victims and to maintain the memorial being built at the site. But for Sarah, the most meaningful moment came on a sunny October afternoon when the memorial was dedicated. 28 granite markers stood in a semicircle, each bearing the name of a victim where known, or simply inscribed, unknown but not forgotten, where identification had not been possible. Grace Thompson's marker was third from the left in the second row, mirroring her position in the photograph. Patricia Chambers stood before her ancestor's marker. Her children and grandchildren gathered around her. She placed flowers at its base and spoke words of love and remembrance. Sarah watched from a distance, tears streaming down her face, knowing that while justice delayed was justice denied. Acknowledgement, however late, still mattered. The photograph that had started everything was now displayed in a climate-controlled case at the memorial site, enlarged so visitors could see the faces in the window. Beneath it was a placard with the words Sarah had written. These people were silenced in life, but their images survived. They demand that we remember, that we acknowledge, that we never allow such horrors to be hidden again. The memorial dedication marked a turning point, but it wasn't the end. The investigation into historical industrial crimes had opened a floodgate, and Sarah found herself at the center of a national movement to uncover and acknowledge America's hidden tragedies. Historical societies across the country began re-examining their archives with new awareness. Photographs, documents, and artifacts that had been catalogued and filed away for decades were now being studied with modern technology and fresh perspectives. What they found was disturbing but not surprising. The Ashford Mill was far from unique. In Philadelphia, researchers discovered evidence of a similar operation at a leather tanning facility. In Charleston, church records revealed a network of orphanages that had actually been fronts for child labor exploitation. In New York, construction workers found remains beneath an old warehouse that investigation revealed had been a brutal sweatshop where immigrant workers had been essentially imprisoned. Each discovery brought more pain, more anger, but also more healing. Descendants who had lived with family stories of mysterious disappearances and unexplained tragedies finally had answers. Communities that had been told their suffering was exaggerated or imagined now had documented proof of what they had endured. Sarah became a leading figure in this movement, advising other archives on how to recognize signs of concealed crimes, speaking at conferences about the importance of examining historical sources with a critical eye, writing papers about the intersection of archival science and social justice. But she never forgot the personal dimension of the work. The human lives behind every document and artifact. 6 months after the memorial dedication, she received a letter from Margaret Whitmore's great-nephew, Robert. He had been going through more of his aunt's possessions and had found something he thought Sarah should see. Sarah met him at a cafe in Beacon Hill, where Robert carefully unwrapped a small leather journal. This was hidden in a false bottom of Margaret's jewelry box, he explained. It belonged to John Whitmore, the man who wrote that diary entry you found. This is a different journal, one he kept secret from his family. Sarah opened the journal with trembling hands. The entries inside were sparse, but devastating. John Whitmore had documented everything he saw at the Ashford Mill after the fire, all the evidence he had helped conceal under threat of violence. But he had also investigated on his own, driven by guilt and a desire for some form of justice. He had tracked down other workers who had escaped or been released from the mill basement, recording their testimonies. He had documented the locations where bodies had been dumped, including several spots along the Charles River and a field outside the city that was now part of a suburban neighborhood. He had even confronted George Ashford in the weeks before the youngest brother disappeared. The final entries, dated November 1863, revealed what had happened to George. John Whitmore had gathered a group of former mill workers and dock laborers, men who had lost friends and family to the Ashford operation. They had kidnapped George Ashford, confronted him with evidence of his crimes, and demanded he confess. According to John's account, George had initially denied everything, then had broken down and admitted the full scope of the operation. "He told us everything," John wrote, "how they had started small, just forcing their own workers to labor beyond their shifts, locking them in to prevent them from organizing or complaining. Then Father had the idea to take it further, to use the basement as a holding facility for people who could be worked to death and discarded without anyone caring. Runaway slaves, free blacks, immigrants, the city's forgotten people." John described how George had claimed he wanted to stop, but feared his brothers would kill him if he tried to leave the operation. He had begged for mercy, promised to testify if they would spare his life. But the men with John, who had lost too much to too many Ashfords, had made a different decision. "We took him to the field, where we had found the bodies of at least a dozen victims," John wrote. "We told him to dig. He dug for hours, uncovering bones and remnants of humanity that his family had discarded like trash. Then we asked him if he had any final words. He said only, 'I deserve this.' We did not make him suffer. We were not monsters like him, but we did what the law would never do. We made sure he could never hurt anyone else." The journal's final entry was dated a week later. "I have recorded this account and hidden it where my descendants might find it someday when enough time has passed that no one living can be prosecuted for what we did. I do not seek forgiveness. I help the Ashfords cover their crimes out of fear, and I help my fellow workers execute justice out of rage. I am going to the police tomorrow to turn myself in, not for George's death, but for my role in concealing the evidence after the fire. Whatever punishment I receive, I will accept. But I wanted the truth recorded somewhere." Sarah researched what had happened to John Whitmore after that final entry. He had indeed gone to the police, but his confession about helping conceal evidence had been dismissed as the ravings of a traumatized man. Without bodies or proof, and with all the Ashford brothers dead or missing, there had been no case to pursue. John had lived another 30 years, working as a carpenter, raising his family and carrying his secrets to the grave. The information about additional burial sites led to new excavations. The field John had mentioned was now a suburban park. Ground-penetrating radar revealed what he had described: a mass grave containing 15 individuals. DNA analysis eventually identified 8 of them, including a man named Samuel, whose letter had been found in the mill basement. His last name had been Williams, and his descendants, found through genetic genealogy, were able to give him a proper burial 162 years after his death. The Charles River locations were more complicated, but dive teams recovered several sets of remains that showed signs of weighted drowning, a method of disposal that matched accounts in John Whitmore's journal. Each recovery, each identification, each burial brought more closure, but also more questions about how many victims there had truly been and how many would never be found. As winter approached again, marking 2 years since Sarah had first examined the photograph, she found herself reflecting on what had changed and what hadn't. The memorial stood. The victims had been acknowledged, convictions had been obtained, and laws had been passed requiring more thorough investigation of historical sites before development. But the broader questions the case raised remained unresolved. How many other crimes were still hidden in historical records, waiting to be discovered? How many powerful families had built their wealth on the suffering of others and maintained it through silence and concealment? How could society reckon with systemic injustices that were so deeply embedded in its foundations? Sarah was invited to speak at a conference on historical accountability in Washington, D.C. Standing before an audience of historians, activists, legal experts and politicians. She displayed the photograph of the 6 Ashford brothers on a large screen behind her. Then she zoomed in on the faces in the window. "These people were invisible by design," she said. "The Ashford brothers and men like them believed they could commit atrocities without consequence. Because their victims were from communities society had decided didn't matter. Enslaved people, immigrants, the poor, free black workers trying to build lives in a hostile world. They were not supposed to be remembered. Their suffering was supposed to be erased." She paused, looking at the faces looking back at her across 165 years. But photography doesn't care about power or privilege. It captures what is there, indifferently, democratically. The Ashfords thought they were preserving their legacy as successful industrialists. Instead, they accidentally documented their crimes. That photograph is a metaphor for what we do in this work. We bring to light what was meant to stay hidden. We give voice to the silenced. We acknowledge what powerful people wanted forgotten. The speech was well received, but what mattered more to Sarah were the conversations that followed. Descendants of victims approached her with stories and questions. Other researchers shared their own discoveries of hidden crimes and mass graves. Politicians discussed legislation that would fund comprehensive archaeological and historical surveys of industrial sites nationwide. A movement was building, a reckoning with history that went beyond symbolic gestures to actual accountability. Companies with ties to historical atrocities were being pressured to acknowledge their past and provide restitution. Educational curricula were being revised to include these uncomfortable truths. Memorials were being erected in cities across the country. But resistance was strong as well. Property owners fought archaeological surveys, fearing what might be found beneath their land. Companies threatened legal action against historians who published damaging findings. Politicians argued that rehashing old crimes served no purpose and only divided the nation. Sarah faced death threats from people who accused her of attacking American heritage and sowing racial division. Her car was vandalized, her office was broken into, and she received letters filled with slurs and threats. The hatred frightened her, but it also confirmed that the work mattered. People didn't threaten those who posed no real challenge to their worldview. She installed better security, varied her routines, and kept working. The photograph of Grace Thompson and the others remained on her desk, a reminder of why the discomfort and danger were worth it. These people had suffered far worse than hate mail and vandalism. They deserved to have their stories told, regardless of who it upset. In the spring, Patricia Chambers invited Sarah to Atlanta for a family reunion where Grace Thompson would be honored. Sarah flew south and found herself embraced by 3 generations of a family that had never known their ancestor, but had always felt her absence. They shared photographs, stories, genetic traits they could trace back to Grace, and tears over what she had endured. "You gave her back to us," Patricia said during the memorial service the family held. "You made sure she wasn't forgotten. That means everything." Sarah thought about all the victims who still hadn't been identified, who might never be identified. She thought about the ones whose remains would never be found, whose stories existed only in fragmentary records or not at all. The work of recovery and acknowledgement would never be complete, but it was still worth doing. Back in Boston, she continued her research, now focusing on the network of associates who had enabled the Ashford operation. The investigation had revealed connections to shipping companies, corrupt police officials, politicians who had looked the other way, lawyers who had helped conceal evidence. Some of these institutions still existed, their modern incarnations built on wealth generated through atrocity. Sarah began documenting these connections, building a comprehensive map of how institutional rot had protected the Ashfords and others like them. It was delicate work, requiring careful verification and protection against lawsuits, but it was necessary. True accountability couldn't stop with the obvious villains. It had to address the systems that enabled them. As she worked late one night in the archive, reviewing documents by the light of her desk lamp, Sarah's phone rang. It was Detective Morrison, his voice excited in a way she had rarely heard. "We found something," he said. "A safety deposit box that belonged to Edmund Ashford. It was in a bank that closed in the 1970s, and the contents went to their successor institution. Someone finally got around to cataloguing old boxes, and they found this one. Sarah, it's full of documents, letters, financial records, photographs. It's going to blow the whole thing wide open." Sarah was at the police station within the hour. The contents of the safety deposit box were spread across a conference table, each item carefully preserved in archival plastic. Edmund Ashford had apparently kept meticulous records of the entire operation, possibly as insurance against his brothers or as a way to maintain control through documented leverage. There were letters detailing transactions with southern plantation owners, shipping manifests disguised as industrial supplies that actually documented human cargo, financial ledgers showing profits from the trafficking operation that dwarfed the mill's legitimate textile business. There were also photographs, dozens of them, showing the mill basement at various stages, the modifications made to transform it into a prison, and most horrifying of all, images of some of the victims before they died. Sarah studied these photographs with tears streaming down her face. The people were emaciated, beaten, clearly terrified, but they were also defiant. In their eyes, even in degradation and suffering, there was resistance, humanity that their captors could not extinguish. These were not just victims. They were people who had fought to survive, to maintain their dignity, to hope for rescue or escape, even when it seemed impossible. Among the photographs was one that made Sarah's heart stop. It showed a group of children, no more than 10 or 12 years old, standing in the mill basement. They were so thin, their ribs were visible, their clothes little more than rags, but they stood with their arms linked, supporting each other. On the back of the photograph, in Edmund Ashford's handwriting, was a note. New arrivals from Richmond should be productive for 2 to 3 years if properly motivated. The casual cruelty of that notation, reducing children's lives to a calculation of exploitable years, crystallized everything Sarah had been fighting against. This was what happened when people were treated as commodities, when profit mattered more than humanity, when power was allowed to operate without accountability. The documents from Edmund's safety deposit box led to new revelations. Several prominent Boston families had been investors in the Ashford operation, providing capital in exchange for a share of the profits. These families, some of whose descendants still held positions of influence, now faced calls for accountability and restitution. Museums and universities found themselves implicated as well. Donations from the Ashford family and their associates had funded buildings and endowments that still bore their names. Pressure mounted to remove these names, to acknowledge the source of the wealth, to redirect the resources toward descendants of victims and educational programs about historical injustice. The debate became national, touching on broader questions about how America should reckon with its past. Some argued for moving forward without dwelling on old crimes. Others insisted that there could be no moving forward without first addressing what had been hidden and denied. Sarah found herself exhausted by the fight, drained by the constant exposure to human suffering, past and present. But she also found strength in the community that had formed around this work. Descendants of victims, historians committed to truth, activists fighting for justice. They all supported each other, shared resources and strategies, celebrated each small victory in the larger struggle. On the second anniversary of her discovery of the photograph, Sarah returned to the memorial site. It was early morning, the sun just beginning to rise over Boston Harbor. The memorial was quiet, peaceful, the granite markers catching the golden light. She walked among them, reading the names, acknowledging each person represented there. At Grace Thompson's marker, she stopped and knelt. "I hope you can rest now," she whispered. "I hope you all can. We see you. We remember you. We're making sure others remember too." As she stood to leave, she noticed an elderly man approaching the memorial. He walked slowly, leaning on a cane, but with purpose. He stopped at one of the markers labeled "Unknown but Not Forgotten" and placed a bouquet of flowers at its base. Sarah approached him gently. "Did you lose someone here?" The man nodded, his eyes wet with tears. "My great-great-grandmother. Her name was Rose, and she disappeared in 1861. The family story was that she had gone to work at a mill and never came home. We never knew which mill, never knew what happened. But when I saw the news about this case, about the victims, I knew in my heart she was one of them." "I'm so sorry," Sarah said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "Don't be sorry," the man replied. "Be proud. You found them. You gave them a place to rest. You made people pay attention. That's more than my family ever thought we'd get." He paused, looking at the memorial. "My granddaughter is studying to be a historian because of you, because of this. She wants to find more hidden stories, more forgotten people. You started something important." As Sarah walked back to her car, the sun fully risen now, she thought about what the man had said. This wasn't just about the past. It was about the present and the future, about building a society that valued truth over comfort, justice over convenience, humanity over profit. The photograph of the Ashford brothers and their hidden victims had been a key that opened a door to buried history. But keeping that door open, ensuring that what had been learned was not forgotten again, that would require ongoing work, ongoing vigilance, ongoing commitment to the principle that no one should be erased from history, no matter how powerless they were in life. Sarah thought about the faces in the window, especially Grace Thompson's pleading eyes. They had been silenced, but they had also been patient, waiting 165 years for someone to truly see them, to hear their silent testimony, to demand justice on their behalf. Their wait was over. The work of honoring them, of learning from their suffering, of building a more just society that would never allow such atrocities to be hidden again, that work was just beginning. And Sarah was committed to it for as long as it took, because everyone deserved to be remembered. Everyone deserved justice. And freedom meant nothing if it wasn't extended to all, protected for all, and built on truth rather than buried lies. The photograph remained on display at the memorial, enlarged and preserved. The faces in the window looking out at a world that had finally stopped to listen. And every day, people came to see it, to learn the story, to pay their respects, and to carry forward the message that the disappeared and forgotten demand. Remember us. Acknowledge what was done to us, and never let it happen again.